We can combine for loops with other statements. For example, since the action of a for loop can include any valid statement, that could include another for loop. So one thing we can do is we can nest for loops. We can have one for loop inside of, or as the action of, another for loop. When we do that, the first loop is called the outer loop, and the one inside it is called the inner loop. The general form of a nested for loop looks like this. We start with the reserved word for, and then we have our first loop variable 1, gets the value of its range, range 1, and then for the action of the outer loop, action 1, we have another for loop. That starts with the reserved word for, and then the second loop variable 2, gets the value of its range, range 2, and then its action. What happens is that for every value of the outer loop variable 1, we execute the inner loop in its entirety. Here's an example of a nested for loop. We start with the reserved word for, and then we have our loop variable I, and I goes through values 1 through 3. For every value of the loop variable I, we're going to execute its entire action. So first we're going to print a star. So in the output we print a star. And then we have an inner loop where j goes through the values from 1 through 5. And for each value of j, we're going to print the value of j. So in other words, we print 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5. And then we print the new line character. That's going to move the cursor down to the next line in the output. So now we've executed the action of the outer loop once. So now the outer loop variable I gets its second value 2. And while I has the value 2, we're going to execute all of the statements in the action. So we're going to print a star, then we're going to print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of the values of j, and then we're going to print the new line character to move the cursor down. Then the outer loop variable I gets the third value 3, and again we're going to execute the entire action. So we're going to print a star, and then j is going to go through the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to print each one, and then we're going to move the cursor down. So in this particular nested for loop, we did not use the value of the outer loop variable I in the action. Instead, it just specified that we're going to repeat the action 3 times. For each value of I, the action was to print a single star, and then we had a nested for loop in which the loop variable j was used in the action. We printed the values of j, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the new line character. So the outer loop specified that we were going to repeat the action 3 times. The action was to print a single star and then print the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the new line character. One application of a nested for loop is to loop through or iterate through all of the elements of a matrix. When you do that with a matrix, you have one loop that iterates over the rows and another loop that iterates over the columns. If what you want to do is to go through the matrix row-wise, row by row in other words, then the outer loop has to be over the rows. If, on the other hand, what you want to do is to iterate through the matrix column-wise, the outer loop has to be over the columns. Sometimes, if you just want to get to all of the elements in the matrix, the order of the loops doesn't matter. But keep in mind that usually in MATLAB, matrix operations can be vectorized. So although in many languages it is necessary to use nested for loops to loop through the elements of a matrix in order to accomplish a task, in MATLAB it is not usually necessary to use loops. We can combine for loops with other statements. For example, we could combine for loops and if statements. The action of a for loop could include an if statement, or the action of an if statement could include a for loop. This is also true for nested for loops. You could have an if statement as part of the action in either the outer or the inner loop. You might want to do this, for example, if the action requires an element on a matrix only if a condition is met. But again, keep in mind that in MATLAB, you can usually vectorize this code.